All right, welcome back to the channel, everybody. I know it's been a little while. I've been kind of busy on a couple projects. One of those right here is the 1969 Chevrolet Camaro. I've been working on this thing for 4 or 5 months now. Had quite a bit of body work to do to the car, and obviously the paint was quite a bit of work as well. But I know the one thing y'all want to know is what this is. So right off the bat, I'm gonna let you know this is not a candy, and it's not just a regular base coat. It is known as a candy base coat. So it's kind of like mixing both of them together. So if you're unfamiliar with either a candy base coat or a candy itself, a typical candy, you spray down something like silver, something that has a lot of metallic in it, and then you're putting in, or on top of it, a translucent layer known as a candy layer. And that gives it a good rich color, as well as a nice bright metallic when the light is actually hitting it. A candy base coat combines those two things together, so you end up with still having a candy mixture, but you have metallics in that candy mixture. And by spraying that over something, in this scenario, it's sprayed over black, you get a really easy to do candy job without a lot of the work that's involved with a true candy. Now the color itself is known as Killshot. This was all done by the spray source. Them, along with the customer, kind of worked together through some samples and created a color that the customer wanted. And so they effectively named this thing Killshot. So if you want to go to the spray source and purchase this color, that's what you're going to be looking for. Now I will tell you, in my scenario here, we went over top of black primer because we wanted that deep color. You can still use these over a silver, you can use them over a charcoal or something of that nature. But if you go with a really light color, it's going to drastically change it. If you look on their website, you'll see some examples of different colors similar to this that will show you what I'm talking about. But like I say, we went over black. So we originally primed this car using all black primer, and then when I final sanded everything, I finished it off with 800 grit. I didn't use any sealer except for just a little tiny touches on some edges where I cut through, but I actually went directly over those 800 grit scratches with the base coat. Had no issues with it. One thing in particular with this color, now one last little caveat when it comes to this color, it contains a pretty coarse metallic, more like a flake. You cannot use a strainer. It will capture all of that metal flake or whatever they have in it. It'll capture it in there and the color won't look right. So you notice how I keep my gun upside down. I do that so that nothing will settle in the neck. And you can see how that metallic is already kind of settled to the bottom there. It's a big red metallic. So this way I can shake everything up. You can see how translucent this is already. So it is pretty much like a candy. That's why you need to spray it directly over black. You can spray it over white. It's going to give you a lot different look. You can spray it over silver and it'll even give you a different look. So it's kind of all up to you, but we're going over black. And like I say, it's just primer sanded, so we don't have to put anything else on. We're going to go directly with our color. I didn't have any issues with it. I mean, there's a few larger specks and clumps in there, but you can't really tell. I also ended up putting 6 coats down because I kind of knew what the customer was looking for. So you could get away with 3 to 4 coats and it would still look good, but to achieve this particular shade just the way I have it, I believe you're gonna have to get to about 5 coats before you kind of hit a saturation point where the color's not really gonna change anymore after that. So 6 coats is what I did on top of here. Now, what that means as well with that heavy metallic or that heavy flake in there is anytime I've used a flake or really coarse metallic, if you have to spray a lot of coats, you get a lot of buildup in your base coat. And if your base coat isn't truly flat, I don't care how good your clear looks when you walk out that booth, a few days later it's going to dry down and it's going to show some almost like a trashy look or kind of a tightening up. And that's just from where it's shrinking over top of that rough base coat. And this color will do the same thing. I put 3 coats using the Alpha line, their Glamour Clear, which also is a good product. I used that on top of it, and with 3 coats, after 3 days, it dried up and excuse me, and you could see that stuff in there. So with that being said, I just made a decision to go ahead and flow coat everything. You know, I don't like polishing too much. You know, it's not my favorite task. I don't know whose favorite task it is, but I definitely don't want to be polishing things like door jambs and all the little nooks and crannies of a car when I can just go through, give it a quick sand with some 600, maybe do a little bit of remasking, especially if you do it in the booth and you have time. You can sand one down and re-clear it in way faster than you can polish it. So that's the route I took to make sure everything laid out nice and smooth. And I did have to kind of get a little bit of a handle on that clear coat to get it to flow out really good. But once I learned the little tricks to that, the clear sprayed great. So if you're using their Alpha line or their Glamour Clear, I will say you're probably going to want to add 10% of a nice slow reducer. If you're using something like a 1.3, their recommendations were a 1.4, and I don't have anything that I shoot any clear with in a 1.4, so I was still using my WS400 in a 1.3. And it's a kind of a thick clear. Like I said, it didn't really want to lay out real nice for me the first time around when I was shooting some parts. Second time, I just kind of changed a little bit of a temperature, made a temperature difference, even though I was using slow activator. And in the third batch of parts, I added that 10% reducer, and that did the trick. Everything flowed out like glass on that last set of parts, so they really didn't need much polishing at all. So 6 coats to get it to look like this, and then, you know, at least 3 or 4 coats, depending on how much polishing you're going to do. You know, if you're just going to sand and flow coat it like I did, you know, 3 coats, give it a quick sand with 600, put you 2 more coats on there and call it a day, unless you want to add another coat or so and do some polishing. Like I say, this one here I did polish, especially all the upper surfaces here. You can see that hood is like glass now. So the hood and the deck lid got a really good polishing. On the fenders, we did add a hockey stripe. This is also from the spray source. It is Cadet Gray. And of course, when I polished it, we cut all that stuff down with 800, get them lines out of there, and then I come back and work my way up into 3000 grit before we actually started to polish. Now the car had quite a bit of body work to it. It actually showed up with quite a bit of work already done. Starting at the rear, it already had the taillight panel, the rear valence, the exhaust cutouts were already there. It had aftermarket quarter panels installed and an aftermarket deck lid sitting on it, aftermarket spoiler. The issue was with some of this stuff is the car had been sandblasted, and the sandblaster ruined quite a few things. They had warped the roof up really bad, and they had also warped up mainly the tops of these fenders. So their original fenders, aftermarket hood, original upper valence, I believe it's a new lower valence, and original lower fender extensions. Original cowl panel, original roof, like I say, where it was messed up. We did add door skins to it because there was some rust on the bottom, so the customer brought door skins when he delivered the car. Now, although the quarter panels were already installed, the customer kind of forewarned me I was probably going to find a mess up in the sail panel area. And after I cut a lot of body filler off of there, I did find where somebody had kind of cut one panel out to get to that quarter panel area where these things are welded in. And once I got that cut away, I realized they actually didn't even weld the new quarter to the inner structure as it's supposed to be along this region here. And then they had made some sort of a new kind of roof edge sail panel piece, and went through and did a bunch of plug welds on it, and then just caked a bunch of body filler on it. So both sides were just as bad as the other. So I went through and I basically used their weld line where they originally had put the pieces in, and started from there, made me some templates, and then I actually, you know, a little bit of work with a mallet and a sandbag, and then I got on the planishing hammer and worked and shaped a piece of a 18 gauge for each side. And then I just took my time welding everything in. I put some copper weld through primer underneath everything. You know, I welded in the new quarters to the understructure as it was supposed to be, and then I took my time welding in my new pieces, just so I didn't have any extra warpage through the roof or through the sail panel. You know, anytime you're doing something where you cannot get behind it and you can't planish those welds out, you need to really control that heat really well. So I was using a MIG welder, had some wet rags around everything, and just took my time making sure every weld cooled down before I moved to the next one, kept jumping around, and eventually I was done and able to just grind my little welds off. And then, you know, a minimal amount of filler went on top of it after that. So on the roof there, you know, did a little bit of a torch work on there to kind of heat shrink a bunch of stuff. Did a lot of heat shrinking on top of the fenders to get those back into shape as best I could. And then we ended up doing body work over pretty much everything. We were using some really good next level blocks. So we had some nice long acrylic blocks to make sure everything was nice and straight. So even though things may look and appear straight, especially if you're using something like a Dura block or some sort of a foam type block, when you use a real good, real hard acrylic block, you find all kinds of fun stuff, even in brand new stuff like the hood. And so we'd already put some primer on a lot of this stuff, because even though there were new parts, we always stripped that E-coat off. You never want to use the E-coat that comes on these things. You don't know how long these things have been sitting in a warehouse, and I have had that bite me in the rear before, where I just went right over top of E-coat, ended up painting a nice 55 Chevy truck, and then a month later I was stripping the tops of the fenders down, trying to figure out what the little bubbles were, and they were rust that was underneath the E-coat that I never saw because I never stripped it off. So anytime you have E-coat on some of this old hot rod stuff, just strip it all off, start with bare metal, that way you know exactly what you have going on. So like I was saying, we had body work on just about everything. We did put door skins on the car. Now while the door skins are off, I went ahead, did a quick job of sandblasting the inside of the doors. And so we put a nice good coat of epoxy on the inside of the door frames. And I went ahead and did the same thing on the inside of the door skins, just because they're in E-coat as well. If you don't put anything on the inside of the door skin, it's eventually going to fade and rust and weather, because there's really no protection in there unless you spray something inside the door. But at least this way they're sealed up. They should last quite a while, even if the customer doesn't ever actually go in there and spray anything. Well, as far as panel fitment's concerned, you know, we made sure everything fit real well. This rear deck, we had to do a little bit of work to make this stuff fit nice and even straight across there on both sides. And then as far as the quarter to door fitment, we did do a little bit of panel to panel body work to make sure that our body lines and our gaps were nice and flush. Now we didn't do a perfect 3/16 gap, but we did make sure everything was nice and even. We just didn't want to have any weird waves going down through the gaps. So they are at least an even spacing as they go down, even though they are not that perfect particular 3/16 of an inch. You can even see the hood's a little wide at the rear on both sides, but in order to fix that, that's a pretty extensive amount of work to fix those gaps, and we just weren't really going that far with this. So we did made sure the car looked great going down the side, which is one thing the customer told me. He said he wanted everything to look nice and straight going down the side, so I believe we achieved that pretty well. Even the deck lid, you know, the deck lid got completely wiped with body filler. And it's not a whole lot of body filler that was put on the car, but just enough to make sure that we could really get everything nice and straight. You don't want to be spraying primer and then sanding that off and spraying more primer. The best solution to making something straight is to use body filler. And you might have to put a lot of body filler on the car. You know, in a sense, this car actually went through 3 gallons of body filler, or kind of like 2.5, but it's on there very, very thin. It only a few places were actually truly damaged. There was a couple dents in the quarter that the customer actually said that he accidentally did. You know, we had a couple spots top of the fenders. But the majority of the body work was just kind of making everything perfectly straight before we went through and actually primed it. So the car only got primed one time, block sanded with 150, then we went to 220, and then I re-primed everything with a couple more coats of the same primer and a little bit of a thinner sense. And then I sanded everything with 800 grit, and we were ready to spray paint. So if you take your time and you go through and you wipe a thin layer of body filler on all these panels where you want everything to be nice and straight, and you use a really good set of blocks like the Next Level blocks, a good acrylic hard block, you get everything super, super straight before you ever put any primer on anything, and you end up with really, really good results that way. And it is a lot of work, but the results speak for themselves when you're done. All right, so to recap, the color is known as Killshot. You can get all this at the spray source. Be sure to get some of their Glamour Clear Coat to top it off with. And as usual, hopefully you learned a little something. If you did, do me a favor, like, subscribe, and tap that bell, and I'll catch you on the next one.